Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Chan, and I am the Assistant Dean for the Program for Faculty Development here at the Faculty of Health Sciences. I'm really excited to have all of these guests here today, and I'm really excited to have our panelists here to facilitate this session. You're tuning in to Online Learning 201. We had a 101 that we've put up as an enduring kind of YouTube event archive, so definitely check that out. If you're tuning into this on YouTube, you can check out the other event. But definitely would love to be able to welcome you to this event. So last time we kind of introduced people to the idea of this toolbox of things that you need for teaching online. And so what we'll be doing is we'll be diving a little bit more into teaching on Zoom and some of the intricacies here. So I'd like to kind of welcome my co-speakers. If they can turn on their videos and wave, I'm sure it'll be awesome. So what we'll do is have them introduce themselves, because I think it'll be great. So Sarah, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much, Teresa. So my name is Sarah Lal, and I'm an assistant professor within the School of Medicine, specifically in this new exciting division called the Division of Education and Innovation. I work primarily on developing entrepreneurial content, so trying to teach people how to do health innovation, how to be entrepreneurial, and ultimately how to commercialize a lot of the great research and clinical work that's going on. Within the faculty development group, I do lead the leadership and management team, trying to get together valuable, impactful content and learnings for the faculty members in health sciences, and hopefully outside of health sciences as well, to learn what they need to know to become great leaders and great managers.
All right, next we're going to have Dr. Palma. Amy, if you can talk about yourself.
Sure. Yep. So I'm Amy Palma. I am an assistant professor in the School of Nursing at McMaster. So I've been teaching for over a decade in the undergraduate program, mainly undergraduate, and a mix of both clinical teaching and PBL, and have been sort of thrust, like many of us, into online teaching given the current pandemic and COVID. So yeah, I'm currently teaching PBL online with our third year nursing students who are doing a semester this spring, summer.
All right, excellent. And Dr. Baer, Elena, if you can introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Alana Baer. I'm director of the Learning Technologies Lab, which is part of the new Continuing Professional Development Office. So we do a lot of collaborative work with Program for Faculty Development, and I'm particularly excited about all the work that's being done in terms of using technology to be able to offer these sessions, as well as to be able to teach you about different technologies that can be used. And I'm also an assistant professor in the Department of Pathology and Molecular Medicine, and I teach in a variety of programs, including the anatomy program for both undergraduate and the med school, and I also teach in the online Masters of Health Science Education program.
Excellent. So we have some really deep expertise here with some really innovative people. So we're excited to have a chat with you all about online teaching. So I'm going to have Sarah take it from here.
Okay, awesome. It's great to have everyone here. We did a quick survey, as many of you saw, just to see who was coming, what your learning needs are, and we found that there was a great mixture of researchers, clinicians, educators from all sorts of areas, and so we're excited to have a very diverse group. But with that also come a diverse set of needs that are kind of brought together by a shared series of anxieties, if you will. So you're all kind of worried about technology not working out, learners not being as engaged, perhaps teaching assessments not being what they were before the pandemic hit. And so I'm hoping that because you all have these shared concerns coming into this, the fall of 2020, we can all have a great discussion around how do we overcome these barriers, these challenges, and make sure that we can make education as effective as possible in these coming months. So as Teresa mentioned, we have a great discussion planned for you today, and we're really going to be focusing on, again, the key principles of online teaching. What should you be thinking about when you're planning online education? Then we'll move into a discussion around what is Zoom. I'm sure we're all familiar with it, given that you're on it right now. but kind of highlighting what is it not, and just making sure you're aware of all the key features, many of which are very conveniently hidden away from you in the account settings on your Zoom account. So if you haven't looked there before, you'll definitely look there after this session. We're going to do some case studies and just walk you through some examples, and with your help, try to figure out how in these particular situations would you use Zoom, would you use online teaching tools other than Zoom, and try to work together to create a strategy for how online education or even management of research groups, which is one of the case studies, would be done, just to maximize learning or maximize management outcomes. And then we'll do a debrief, kind of take you through our thoughts on the different case studies that we did discuss, and kind of try to see what was most helpful to you, what do you want to learn more about, because maybe at the end of the day, there's going to be online teaching 301. We want to keep this series of sessions, these workshops, continuing as long as you need them to continue, to, again, make sure that learners are well supported and you as educators are well supported in the coming months. So in terms of who's here, we kind of all discussed this already. It's a mixture of clinicians, educators, and researchers. But as we begin the conversation, if you'd like, it would be nice for you to introduce yourself in the chat, just your name and where you're from, and that will help us orient ourselves as we continue the dialogue and get into the case discussions. So feel free to do that as I'm speaking. So starting off, what is online teaching? What are some general principles? So online education is, as it sounds, it's the delivery of education through online mediums. So typically this is typically through Zoom, it can be Microsoft Teams, it can be App Me to Learn. There's different ways in which online education is currently done, but I wanted to flag some of the differences between online education and in-person teaching to start. So online teaching, as you've probably figured out, is either asynchronous or synchronous, which means that you either need to be there in the moment with the learners, or you can pre-record, pre-curate content and resources and provide them to your learners as required. In online education, you can do either large or small group sessions, and typically you have multiple options for different software, different tools, different channels that you can use. And because of that increased flexibility, sometimes it's very confusing to decide what is the right thing to use for an intended purpose. Now, contrast that with in-person sessions, where we have largely lecture style or small group discussions, and beyond that, there's a little bit less variety sometimes, it seems, because we don't necessarily rely on technology as much. We simply vary the types of interactions that we have and go from there. But I wanted to emphasize that regardless of the environment that we're trying to engage learners in, it needs to be an environment where learners are kept accountable for being active and being alert and responsible for their uptake of the knowledge or the skills that we're trying to impart on them, or they're trying to learn with their peers. So the challenges with online learning sometimes, and this influences us as educators quite a lot, is a lack of motivation to continuously engage in content over time, a lack of engagement. Perhaps we feel isolated, or perhaps we feel like we can't really relate to the peers that we're taking the course or the workshop with. The feeling of isolation, especially in this pandemic. It's hard to go out and socialize, and so there's an increased need to have that encompassed within the type of education that we do. Sometimes it requires more preparation, actually, because you need to be able to answer more questions. You need to be able to do more work outside of your typical expectations for what you would be doing in an in-person setting. Then when it comes to time, sometimes it's surprising, but as educators, it's very important for online education to also have more strict boundaries of when you're on and when you're off. Now, with the fact that people can message you all the time, they can interact with you all the time, sometimes it's a little scary because you'll get emails at 10 p.m., 3 a.m., it'll be at all hours of the day, but it's just important for individuals to understand, your learners to understand what your operating hours are and when they can expect to receive a response. And typically I found that if you manage those expectations, it doesn't really matter when they message, because there will not be any anxiety about you not having read something, because they will know when to expect a response from you. So the big question is, when you have in-person teaching and you're suddenly asked to transfer things online, is it simply a transfer process? Do I simply shift everything that I'm doing in person to an online format? And the answer isn't yes, and the answer isn't no. Unfortunately, it's one of those things where you have to say maybe. It actually depends. So learning environments, again, they need to be designed to meet the needs of the learner. So sometimes that means you're going to have to take extra effort to put more content together. Sometimes it needs to be more effort to creating additional tools or channels for communication to have between yourself as the educator and the student. But overall, there can be a similar flavor. Just depends on what you did in the in-person interactions. But examples of questions that a learner may have, and this may influence your case studies later on when you have your discussions, questions may be, what is expected of me? Sometimes they're not understanding what the assignments entail. They don't understand what they need to learn. How do I check that I am really learning and understanding concepts? Learners often come with the best of intentions, but they don't know if they're doing well. So if they read a piece of information, an article, if they complete a module, if they are asked to read a chapter, which components should they be pulling out? And how do they really know that they understand what is relevant for future success? How is this relevant? How does this tie to overall course objectives? When and where can I ask questions? Do you have office hours, or do you ask questions ad hoc as needed through email? Are there additional resources to learn? Sometimes there are great series on YouTube. There's a TED Talk. There's websites where they can find more information. Perhaps an additional textbook. It's always helpful as an educator to just point them to additional resources as required for their learning. Who are these people learning with me? So this is not a question that you would get a lot before the pandemic, but now increasingly as we move into online interactions, we're in spaces where we've literally never met these people before. So we're going to find ourselves as educators also need to do things like icebreakers and need to introduce people to each other and have them create that safe environment where learning can happen. And there's a lot of questions around that, and a lot of thinking that needs to be done. But it is very important to understand that learning environments are things that need to be created, nurtured, and it's not just going to happen because everyone's around in that same course. Do I belong here? So I work with some medical students as part of the MF tutorials, and a lot of the time there's a sort of crisis they're having. They don't know if they know enough relative to their peers. So there's going to be a lot of making sure that people feel as though they are intended to be in the program, they are intended to be in this class, and just validating that what they know, what they've achieved academically so far is enough to get them to where they are today. So again, the social aspect. And last but not least, how is this evaluated? It's not very difficult with tests, with exams, but sometimes it's quite challenging for written assignments, reports, innovation projects on my end especially, where there are no rubrics, there are no rules or written expectations, and so that leads to a lot of confusion. And when it's an in-person environment, you can manage that confusion by being available to answer questions, by being able to have them talk to their peers. But when you're in an online setting, it actually leads to disengagement. So just make sure that, especially within an online forum, that effective communication and clarity around expectations is almost even more important, because it can't be buffered by opportunities to interact with you directly, read your nonverbal expressions, and also interacting with their peers. So in terms of how to actually manage all that information, we've been thinking about putting together a bit of an online teaching checklist. And we talked about this last time during Online Teaching 101, and we talked a bit about setting clear expectations, ensuring that the relevance of the course asks are really clear for what the learning path looks like, having things like direct communication channels with peers, having feedback, opportunities for social interactions, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, from going through a checklist, which I think is helpful for some people, we found that all of these expectations on the checklist actually fit into 4 buckets. And that's where we came up with the online teaching toolkit, which I think is a really, really neat way of thinking about what needs to be true for an online learning experience. And then from there, you can design a productive environment in which your learners will be able to learn what they need to. So the first component of the online teaching toolkit is the face-to-face place. So we have Zoom right here. I can't unfortunately see most of your faces, but Zoom, like Google Hangouts, like WebEx, is a place where you can begin to build social rapport. You can see someone's face, you can hear what they say, listen to how they say it, but also see their facial expressions. And so that's how the beginning of the social interactions, and the beginning of creating a sense of place where people feel like they belong, and they begin to create relationships with one another, including yourself as the educator. Then second thing that you need to have as an online teaching environment is a digital corridor. So as you can imagine, maybe based on your own experiences, you don't come up with all your questions in the learning session, in the asynchronous learning session. You don't talk to all your peers in that learning session. And so what we're finding that learners are creating themselves is channels for them to communicate between lectures, between sessions, to work on assignments, to get a better sense of what the expectations are, etc. And so things like Slack, things like Facebook Messenger, Microsoft Teams are excellent kind of back channels where individuals like you or students can actually engage with one another and get the clarifications that they need, or those additional conversations that they need to be successful. The third component of the online teaching toolkit is productivity tools. And this is more or less relevant depending on the work that you're doing. I typically find that productivity tools really depend on whether the learners see the need for it. So things like project management tools, Asana is an example, they are very helpful when you have several people working on a project and they need to delegate tasks to one another. So perhaps that's not needed for every single course, but for a research group, it may be very helpful to set deadlines to make sure that things are moving along as they should be. Whereas things like Google apps like Google Docs or Google Slides are really helpful collaboration tools, even for medical students in the PBL tutorials, to be able to share information, to be able to set objectives together and make sure that they're sharing images or links to relevant articles as they need to do so. Then finally, social touch points. So I know that I already talked about these social interactions, these conversations happening in the digital corridor, but it's important to note that these kind of social touch points can also happen synchronously through how you design interactions on the face-to-face place. So over Zoom, it's essential for us to be able to engage in small groups or in the larger classroom in a check-in exercise. So see how people are doing. Do they want to share something that they did that was exciting over the weekend? Even things like that, just to bring a bit of a human element, are very, very helpful to increase group cohesion and also make sure that everyone feels welcome and included and like they know others who are in that learning experience with them. And so I hope that this framework, you'll use it during the case studies, and it'll be circulated to you after this Zoom session. But now I'd like to invite my colleague Amy to talk a little bit more about Zoom. So the pros, the cons, sorry, not the cons, the cautionary tales, and the opportunities that this great platform really affords for education.
Great, thank you. So I'm just gonna go advance to the next slide. I don't know, can I? There we go. So I've just taken a screenshot of what my Zoom page would look like as a facilitator to go through some of the key features, because if you've only attended a Zoom meeting as an attendee, then it would look a little bit different. So we'll go through just the items that are listed here on the screen. So getting a Zoom account, so anyone can sign up for a Zoom account. So I can see from the chat that there are some people affiliated, not necessarily with McMaster. So getting an account It would be through the zoom.us website if you haven't already signed up for one. McMaster, for those teaching through McMaster, does have a site license, and so they've asked us if we're teaching through McMaster to go through the UTS. There's a page through Technology Services to request a Zoom McMaster account for those who are teaching with McMaster. And that's sort of the first step. Once you've got a Zoom account, as Sarah has talked about, there's a number of features that you have to enable in advance. And once you've done that in advance, can change some of the icons and buttons that are sort of down at the bottom. So the first thing that you'll need to do once you get an account is to log back into that account on the web portal and actually start scheduling your meetings. So a few tips around scheduling. So you need to set up a number of features in advance through that scheduling portal. I would recommend setting up recurring meetings if you've got weekly classes. That helps so that you then don't have to send out the link week by week by week, but you can send out the link once to students or your learners. So I'm doing a 12-week PBL and I've only had to send, I'm on class 5 tomorrow, I've only had to send a link out once and it continues to work. So there's an option to click off when you're scheduling your meeting to set up a recurring meeting, and it'll ask you to set up how often. So I find that's very helpful, and it prevents you from having to then send the link out multiple times if you're meeting weekly with students or learners. It's very easy then, once your meeting has been set up, to copy and send the link. There's a button to copy and paste it to send it to people. The other button that you can use is the little eye icon that's at the top left of our screen right now. So on my button, it would be here. And that'll also give you the meeting information sort of in real time. I don't know, there's a lot of meetings that I've attended where I get last minute emails from people. What's the link? I know we're supposed to be meeting. I can't remember. And then I've got to log out or sort of get out of Zoom, go in my email, find out where the link was, or log back into the web portal. So I found that's a quicker way that the little information icon could quickly just copy the meeting to send it to somebody who's needing to join sort of last minute or who might get disconnected and need to reconnect. So that's sort of a quicker way to have the copy and paste function right there. So your meeting information button is there. The other things that you can set up while you're scheduling, there's a number. I can't go through everything because there's lots. I would really recommend playing around with the features on Zoom. Get your family to do a Zoom meeting where you're the facilitator first, just to see what things look like and get used to how to set things up. There's lots of options, and I find it's fairly intuitive. I'm not hugely tech savvy, but I'm able to navigate quite well. Audio and video settings for participants, so you can set whether or not you want them to have video or audio or just the host. You can set up some of the security features, which we'll get down to security. There's a security button in a live meeting, but there are some functions that you can set up ahead of time. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in the cautionary tales. But you're able to set up a waiting room. You can disable that students or learners can't join before the host. You can't have people sort of sitting in your meeting ahead of time. You can set it up so that you require users to have a password to get into the meeting, and I would highly recommend doing that for all your meetings. And that just decreases the risk that someone randomly out there could guess what your meeting ID is and get into your meeting. The other option is that you can lock. Another security feature is to lock the room. So once you know that everybody, if it's students in your class, is in and you sort of take an attendance, or you can also lock the room so that people then can't get in without sort of knocking or asking. Other options that you can set up when you're scheduling is whether or not participants will be able to screen share. You can also set that up on the fly. So I've sort of enabled a security button on my screenshot here that you could quickly either enable or disable screen share, but you can also set that up in advance. Enabling breakout rooms. So I have the breakout room button on my screen down here at the bottom, but I had to set that up ahead of time. It took me a while to figure out when I was first using this. So that is something that you have to enable when you've scheduled your meeting, and also have to enable when you've created your account that you want to create breakout rooms. And the breakout rooms can either be done on the fly. You can assign people randomly. Breakout rooms can be pre-assigned in advance. So if you know that you already want to put people into certain groups, you can assign them by email address. The trick with that is then the learners have to use the same email address that you've used for them. So I have about half my class who the breakout rooms pre-assigned will work, and the other half haven't logged in with a McMaster email, and I have to manually assign them. But that's the other option. You can manually assign them, and it works quite quickly, even on the fly, to be able to assign people to breakout rooms. Other functions, you can automatically set up to record the meeting. So Teresa's recording this and she hit the record button sort of listed at the bottom, but you can automatically have it set up so that if you know you want to pre-record lectures and we want to make sure that you don't forget to do it, you can set it up ahead of time. Another thing that you'll need to enable ahead of time, I don't have it, I just enabled it after I did this screenshot, is the polling feature. So if you want to add a poll, you need to enable that in your account, and then within that scheduled meeting, you need to scroll down and actually add in your polling questions. So I have a little bit more about that, but wanted to just go through that in terms of the things you need to set up in advance through the scheduling. Once you've sort of started the meeting, like I said, the meeting icon's in the top left, your participants. So I have to take attendance in the classes that I'm teaching. So it's nice to have the participant list that's sort of listed there. The chat function, again, can be visible on the slide or not, depending on how much screen room. I always find I'm sort of running out of screen room to be able to see all my learners. So even just managing how many widgets are sort of open at a time can be tough. The chat, you can enable that ahead of time to be saved. So if you are having students sharing ideas or sharing files in the chat, that you can automatically have that enabled so that the chat can be saved if that's something that you either want to save and send out to people. That has to be saved ahead of time. So I've talked a little bit already about some of the security features that you can set up ahead of time. The security button down here, when you're live in a meeting, you can lock it. So usually, 5-10 minutes after my class has started, I might hit that lock button then. And then I can allow or disallow, enable or disable whether or not I want participants to screen share, chat, whether they can change their name. Again, if I need to make sure, it is quite different without being able to see everybody's faces. So it's taking me longer to learn my students' names. So it is nice to make sure that they have their proper name listed. So if they can rename themselves, if they're, iPad or, and actually put their names, it does help. And the participants can do that under the participant bar and change their names there. And again, you can enable or disable whether or not students can unmute themselves or whether that has to be done by the host. So again, the breakout rooms, the button, you have to enable it in advance, but the breakout rooms, you can hit that button and it will ask you to pre-assign, or it'll ask you whether you want to randomly assign people or manually assign, and you just hover over their name and assign them to a group, and it'll ask you how many groups that you want to create. The whiteboard function, so the whiteboard function I can show, because I think I can screen share here if people aren't familiar. I don't want to get out of the present. So the whiteboard, get out of it and demonstrate and come back. So is it okay if I show the whiteboard? Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I didn't know how much back and forth to do from the presentation.
All you want.
So I'm teaching PBL, so I feel the whiteboard is a good function to have when we're concept mapping or generating ideas. So you can draw, type in text or whatever you like. You can change the color. You can add drawings. You can add, and then there's the function to save it doesn't need to be set up ahead of time, but you can actually just click the save button and then send that to students if you needed to. So the whiteboard, I find, especially for applications related to PBL, when we're doing a lot of concept mapping or brainstorming, the whiteboard's a good function, and then you're not necessarily changing between too many applications as well too. Thanks, Teresa. Okay, so I'll stop sharing that and go back to our slides. Polling, I just want to talk a tiny little bit more about polling. So polling, again, has to be set up in advance. You can't do that sort of on the fly, and the button would end up at the bottom of the screen. So you can add a number of polls. Polls can have a couple different questions. If you wanted to add in a couple of multiple choice questions about certain content, you could add one poll that had a couple different questions. And then you would just click on the polling button and it would pop up the poll question that you wanted to ask, and it would poll the users in real time. You can also then share the results with students, and then you can reset it and poll again. So if, I don't know, you wanted to do sort of a pre and post, you could poll at the beginning of the class and poll later to see if their answers change sort of towards the end of the class. But I did find if you want the questions to show up separately, it needs to be created as 2 separate polls, because if you add 2 or 3 or 4 questions under one poll, they'll all pop up together when I was sort of playing around with the polling function. So, all right, I think We can go to the next slide about some of, I think it's the cautionary tales. Good. Sorry, I can only see Sarah. Hang on one second.
I think that we'll just, if you just full screen it again, and then I think Sarah just needs to screen share again, because I think it stopped screen sharing.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Awesome, thank you.
There you go.
So major concerns that people are worried about, and then we've put in some sort of workarounds or some tips or ideas that we might have about addressing those worries. So decreased learner engagement has been a big concern, sort of discussed even in our pre-survey, but also in the literature around online learning, and just some ideas that we thought about around increasing learner engagement as the environment online is a bit different, is really discussing those upfront, establishing those norms with your group, establishing some of those group contact rules. You know, I had a chat with my students about, you know, I want to make this as interesting for you, so I'm really going to rely on you guys to be involved and be active and participate in discussion. I do find the use of video, and again, I understand concerns about bandwidth and things as well, but if students can leave video on, I do find it's helpful because of that ability to even get some nonverbal facial expressions, thumbs ups from people, even if they're not, don't have their microphone on, but having that video, I find actually does give me some feedback and input as to whether or not the learners are staying engaged. Really working on building in opportunities for engagement. So again, using those breakout rooms. If students are reluctant to talk in a big, larger group, then having them sort of move off into a breakout room, even for 5 minutes as a sort of think, pair, share kind of activity. Building in opportunities for discussion questions. Having opportunities, if people are in breakout rooms or doing small group work, to have note-taking, whether that's through Google Doc, and sharing summaries that they're set off in those breakout rooms and actually have a task that has to keep them engaged, and building in those opportunities as you design your lesson. And then even encouraging the use of chat for participation. I'm thinking particularly even in larger group sessions where having everybody chime in verbally might be a little bit difficult, but even using the chat for participation is one at least benefit I find with online teaching, that if people have quieter students, that sometimes typing might even encourage them to participate more so than they would be comfortable putting their hands up in a live session. Security concerns. Again, I think Zoom has responded a lot as we all sort of quickly moved online in mid-March. And I sort of discussed a number of these. So when you set up your meeting, making sure that there's a meeting password that's there as an extra security feature. Enabling the waiting room, so as the host you have some control over who is admitted into that meeting, disabling the join before host option, locking the meeting after it's begun, and disabling the option for attendees to share screen. I don't necessarily do that, but again, if it was a really large meeting and you wanted to make sure that someone wasn't able to get in and then share their screen, then that would be another good security feature to be able to do. And then some pros. I think we hear a lot about the cons, but I think there are a number of pros and what you could be excited about too. I think online gives us a number of opportunities to engage in a new way with learners. I mean, the commute's better, right? With online teaching, you save a lot of time. So overcoming challenges due to location and timing. I think as everyone's very busy, you know, everyone can think of an example of a time where you couldn't attend a meeting because you couldn't be two places at the same time, right? Being online affords you a little bit more of that opportunity. So challenges related to location and timing are easier to overcome online, I think. Again, the breakout rooms for small group discussion, not that you couldn't necessarily do small group discussion in person, but I'm thinking even about physical barriers, about some of the rooms that you might get or rooms that you're assigned, especially in larger groups, if they're lecture style seating, breaking out into small groups when your chairs can't turn and you don't have tables, and the physical space just doesn't allow for that, can be a challenge. And so breakout rooms are great to be able to do that online. I think it does afford some alternate ways for participation, especially for quieter learners. I teach first year students who, you know, coming into our nursing program are 17 or 18 years old and often very quiet and shy. And I think even just encouraging them breakout rooms in smaller groups, easing them in with sort of the chat function, it just gives an opportunity for quieter learners or in larger groups for people's voice to be heard. And online teaching, not necessarily with Zoom, but overall really has, I think, increased our ability to share information. So again, not unique to Zoom, but being able to share files, videos, posts, resources, sort of in real time, I think has really increased our ability to share information in an online environment, which we might not necessarily always be able to do face to face. I think, again, now everyone sort of has a laptop and is online, and that sharing can happen in real time, but online definitely affords that as a bonus.
All right. So hopefully that was a positive experience for everyone. I know we had 4 cases, so 4 breakout rooms, and I know that a few people had to drop off at 6 p.m. But I know that quite a lot of you are still sticking around for the debrief. So really happy to hear what your learnings were from the different cases as we kind of take up the different sessions that we just had. So what's going to happen now is that there were 4 cases, and so the 4 facilitators will lead a discussion on the kind of key takeaways or considerations that you may have had from those discussions. And if there's anything else to add based on what you learned or based on what your thoughts were on the case itself, feel free to kind of put that thought in the chat or unmute yourself and contribute to the dialogue like live. Okay, so I'm going to start with my case study. So this case study, for those in the room, you know, but for others, this case study was all about problem-based learning within FHS, as well as how research groups can benefit from putting more effort into structuring an online experience. And so really, both of these challenges, as we read through the case, were about maximizing online productivity. So the key thing here was that the faculty member who was teaching PBL, he had noted or observed that students actually met up a lot at the tutorial. They had a lot of interactions where they shared insight on what their discussions during tutorial were all about. They shared their interpretations of the objectives that were set through the PBL process. And by having all those conversations, having all those interactions, they were actually able to clarify for themselves if they were on the right track for doing the work that they needed to do. And so what the faculty member wanted to do was somehow to replicate those interactions that were happening in an informal fashion in person. But also what he wanted to do was make sure that the formal need, i.e. that learners must be able to acquire content and knowledge and demonstrate an understanding of key concepts, that was still able to be done. In terms of the research group, the observed need there was that there's a research group, their research itself is already kind of mobile friendly. So the research was with wearable devices, and it was about tracking exercise patterns. However, they really didn't need to interact with participants directly, but the faculty member was very worried about the fact that the research group members, so the grad students, the postdoc, weren't really interacting as much anymore. They weren't having as many calls. They were emailing only when they really needed to. And so he was a little worried that the productivity of his research group would be going down. And so just thinking about these different needs that were expressed, the group seemed to agree that Zoom was useful, but Zoom is not the be-all, end-all of all solutions. So even though online video conferencing is great through Zoom, it's a great experience, it cannot be the only touch point, it cannot be the only portal for information sharing, and it was really important for us to consider other elements of that online teaching toolkit So things like the social touch points, things like the productivity tools, and things like the digital corridor to make sure that there's enough other interactions to enhance the experience and be able to truly meet the needs that were expressed by the research group and by the learners themselves. So a few points here is that in terms of digital corridor for the PBL tutorials, you can use Slack, you can use Teams, you can use Facebook Messenger. In my experience with medical students, they really love Facebook Messenger just because they're so familiar with it and it's very easy to set up a group chat. But I am not connected to them on Facebook, right? So I'm not part of that group chat. However, what I am part of with them is a Slack community. And so they can use Slack during tutorials to share images, to share resources, and they also direct message me on Slack if they have a question or when they're submitting their weekly question to me, because I create a poll on a weekly basis so I can kind of quiz them and assess their understanding of content based on questions that they generate themselves. So that's a great solution that's worked for me, but in this scenario, it would also be quite applicable.
So Sarah, an alternative to that might be also WhatsApp as another alternative as
Exactly.
well, because then you don't have to add them to Facebook, which can be a little awkward sometimes,
Yes.
but you can partition that, and it's run by the same people. It has a long level of encryption. You shouldn't share patient information, but if you're just saying, hey, where's the Zoom link? That's like easy, right?
Exactly. So that's a great other example of a digital corridor. In terms of for the research group, perhaps Facebook Messenger isn't as good because you'd be using this digital corridor to share more resources. So things that you actually have to see a preview, and then scrolling through Facebook Messenger would be kind of not as convenient. So Slack and Teams are a little bit better for real-time communication or asynchronous communication. In terms of productivity tools, there was a mention in the discussions that we just had that things like Asana would be very helpful for the research groups, just because those are usually more complex projects over the longer term. And using that alongside things like Google Documents would be awesome. Microsoft Teams is also an option. However, it's used a little sporadically across different areas of the university, but it also serves a similar kind of purpose. Now, one of the participants in the group did mention, and I don't know if you want to kind of highlight yourself, but he did mention that Dropbox actually has some functionality now to be able to do live editing with your collaborators. And that's the first time I'm hearing about that. But if that's true, that's great. And that indicates that Dropbox may be another place where you can store your files, but you can also collaborate with other members of your team to be able to edit your documents in real time. In terms of productivity tools for PBL tutorials, a little bit different. You don't really need project management. You're not really delegating tasks to everyone as frequently. It's not really a long-term project if you do set objectives and give someone a task to do. And so you don't really need to focus on those kind of project management tools, but the productivity tools that do work really well are things like Google Docs. And then in terms of social touch points, a really interesting idea that came up in our group for the research group was to have some kind of a mixture of Zoom calls that are more formal, but also Zoom calls that are less formal, so more kind of more problems that are happening, if they're happening, and with those issues being flagged, you can work to resolve them. And so it just seems like for the research group, having social touch points through a Zoom social, or having just maybe something we didn't talk about this, but having a Slack channel where you can share images or other kind of funny stories could be another thing to do. And then in terms of additional things, this is just extra, but as I mentioned for PBL tutorials, the polling feature is really helpful for learners to assess their own understanding of things that they themselves are kind of setting objectives for and trying to really understand through their own research. Whereas for research groups, something you may want to think about because I know that Microsoft Teams is increasingly popular within the McMaster community. If you're working with external collaborators, so people who aren't within the McMaster University faculty or staff, it's more difficult to set them up with Microsoft Teams, and so Slack and Zoom are just easier to send them a link to and for them to engage with you on those platforms. Again, that's a lot of me talking. Does anyone else from the first group want to chime in with any additional things that I may have missed? I know Farah, you had a lot of good points. Joanne, you had a lot of great points. And if you're comfortable, I'd love to have you share with the rest of the group.
It's also okay if you're not wanting to. That's okay. Yeah.
And I think most of my points were more questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. Why don't we move on to the next team? I think Amy is going to give some summary about her experience.
Yep. So our scenario was a relatively new assistant professor, has taught for 2 terms, and is now, as a result of COVID or whatever other reason, being forced to teach online now. And so it was sort of a medium-sized classroom setting. So when you're having sort of 25, 30, 40 learners, would Zoom be appropriate? What other considerations do you need to have? The other pieces of the scenario were, again, concerns about student engagement and participation, as that's important in the course, and also an element that the students have a presentation that they need to do. So thinking about how could that be adapted to online, whether that should be synchronous or asynchronous, and just some considerations around that with a medium-sized class. Some takeaway points, again, just consider using a mix of large group learning activities and small group breakout rooms. Again, that class size of sort of 25, 30, 40 is used in a variety of settings, I think, on our campuses. And so it can be prohibitive sometimes to have good discussions in 40. So really utilizing the strategy of your breakout rooms. Enacting some of the strategies we talked about around engagement and participation. So using the polling features, having built-in discussion questions. Sometimes I'll even post my discussion questions in advance so the students have a chance to kind of prepare and gather their thoughts to sort of enrich the discussion. Again, considering the student perspective. So in this scenario, the students were new to online teaching as well. Again, most of our students are fairly tech savvy, but you need to think about, do they have to have some kind of orientation to the online platform that you're using? I find especially if they're going to be responsible for being sort of the host or the facilitator during presentations. Again, my students tend to be quite well versed with being attendees at meetings, but as soon as I then flip it to have them screen share or be in charge, I can see them get a little flustered, like, oh, it looks different than than it did when I was attending, or I'm not sure how to screen share. So having that opportunity for them to rehearse ahead of time, especially if it's for a presentation that's graded. So again, allowing them that opportunity to rehearse ahead of time. And again, asking for help. We're all really new to this. This is sort of not a move to planned online activities. So really asking for help, sharing ideas with other faculty, especially for someone who's relatively new to teaching, period, and then adding on the element of then moving things online too.
All right, that's great. Okay, I think we're going to move on to Alana now.
Excellent. So our case scenario was around an instructor who is mid-career. They've been teaching in face-to-face classes, really comfortable with that. They thrive in that environment. And for them, one of the key things is the presence, both of themselves, the students, the student engagement. And with the move to remote working, they're suffering after these past couple months, a lot of virtual fatigue. And so now with the move to online for the fall, they're worried for themselves and for their students are we just going to have this huge virtual fatigue, and how are they going to keep their students engaged if they do virtual lectures? So in this scenario, the instructor teaches a large anatomy class to about 800 students. And so they're questioning whether they're even going to do online lectures in a virtual synchronous format. And if they do, is it simply just taking what they did with their PowerPoint slides in the large lecture hall and moving that online? Or is there something else they should be considering as well? And so we had discussion within our group, at first even just thinking about the content and what content could we deliver in the online environment. And so for anatomy, are we going to be having more, I guess, sort of drier content where we're talking about definitions perhaps and some concepts and not really getting into the gross anatomy, which requires that hands-on that we would be doing in person. And so the content itself would have to be considered. The issue that this is one instructor with a class of 800 students, and how could they possibly engage with that number of students and it just be sort of this one-way communication. And then that led us into the discussion of whether Zoom as a tool could even handle that number of students. And with our current licenses, so the Zoom meeting, the one we're using today, we have an upward limit of 300. So that brought us into discussion, well, if we can only have 300 students on at a time, and we were to use this type of licensing, would we perhaps want to think about having multiple sessions? And then what is that from a resource standpoint? So as you could see, when we start talking through the scenario, we have a lot of different considerations that start to roll out. And so just to kind of add in some additional considerations that I'd pulled together in advance of our discussion was really considering the frequency. So how often are your lecture slots going to happen? Is this a class that happens maybe twice a week, 3 times a week? What is the length? Is it an hour versus a 3-hour session? The size of your class. So are we talking about 20 students or 800 students? And looking at the modality, is delivering a synchronous live lecture the best way to use that virtual class time? Or are there other ways that you can pre-record the lecture and then use that virtual class time to do other activities that might be more engaging? Thinking about a variety of content presentation and learning activities. So perhaps if you are delivering a lecture, having PowerPoint slides with video as well. So you're breaking up that lecture, incorporating polling activities or breakout rooms. And just some tips that I came across when I was looking at some strategies for large lecture classes, and this can apply if you're doing a virtual meeting as well. And I'm calling it a 60 seconds connection. These are really very short connections with your audience, whether it's your learners or your colleagues, about why is it important for them to be here, and even starting in the first 60 seconds of your meeting or your class. And this is something you might do in a face-to-face environment as well, creating that hook, that engagement. Another one I came up with was the minimum viable PowerPoint, or MVP deck. And I really like this one because many of us struggle with this regardless of whether we're in class or online. And we pack a number of PowerPoint slides into our lecture time slot and try to get through all of this content. And if you've been in sessions where you've seen a lot of PowerPoint slides, it can be a lot to absorb, especially in that online viewing. And so what are the least amount of slides you can use to make it understandable what you're trying to get across to your learners and your audience? And think then instead of talking around those slides, what are the experiences you can share, other ways you can engage them? And then that leads us into meaningful engagement opportunities. And not just, kind of thinking of polling for the sake of polling just to see, are they awake and are they clicking on a button? But having them feel that there is some responsibility there. And perhaps it's because you're taking a temperature check of where they're at with their understanding, and that may guide your next direction in your lecture session. And having a moderator. So usually when we get to class sizes of around 15 to 20 students, and we're going to be actively using the chat function especially for back channel communications, we recommend having a moderator who can moderate that chat function as well to keep things moving and help with that virtual class management. And I'm open, if anybody else wants to add in some other tips or considerations for this scenario.
I think that's so, it's really an interesting set of comments, Alana, and I wanted to share something. So there's a course, or it's currently a certificate program, but it should be a course in the fall called Innovators in Scrub that I teach in. And the program itself relies on student learners going to the hospitals, identifying health challenges that need to be addressed, and then developing solutions in response to them. And the development of solutions is pretty straightforward to do in a virtual way, especially when we're doing a lot of digital innovation. but the interactions, the conversations, kind of doing observations and then asking questions, why did you do this? Why did you do that? And that probably can't happen in the fall. So it's really interesting to kind of try to dig in and see what can be virtualized, how can it be virtualized, and if this needs to be virtualized, I'm kind of thinking that I'm going to need to create some podcasts or some like videos and really prep hard this summer just to make sure that we're ready when September hits and we're able to provide a similar type of experience. But that's just an example of something that would be very intensive for the experiential element. And how do you consider ways to try to bridge the gap and try to create a virtual interaction?
Yeah.
I don't know.
There's some cool things that you can probably think of and have people tell their stories and talk about their pain points and stuff like that could be done that would be a surrogate for it. It's not the same as observing yourself, but I think it'd be pretty cool to like even have them maybe, if they could, participate in some of the meetings that are going on. So it might be working with the hospitals, like can they zoom in and listen to some of the health systems problems? So there might be different environments where we can think of for immersive activities. We're not covering a lot of those today, but I'm going to push that to some other kind of webinars that we'll be running later on. But we're going to be focused on the clinical environment. Virtual care is a big frontier where we might be able to invite people in to learn in those situations too. So
I have a question here if I can.
Yeah.
Hey.
Sorry, Sunil Upati here.
Hi, Sunil.
Hey, Therese. I had a question by that I posted in the chat, but if you have a group of adult learners who might be different than medical students or residents, whatever the case may be, I'm concerned about the idea that it was brought up about Zoom fatigue or video fatigue. What might be the optimal length of a pre-recorded learning module online before they tune out and walk away, especially lay people? I'm thinking not more than 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes max, with 3 to 5 learning points, and then you're done.
So Sunil, that's how TED Talks are constructed, which is under 20 minutes. They actually looked at their data and it's 18 minutes. And that's why all TED Talks, they'll cut people off at 18 minutes. So that's something to bear in mind. But the MOOC data, so that's where actually people are learning coursework. The MOOC data suggests that people have the tolerance for 8 minutes, and probably 75% of people have tuned out by 12 minutes. So it's actually very, very short period of time. Podcasts, people have more tolerance for. I think it's because of the cognitive load, like you're just listening, you're not also reading. And so for podcasts, 20 minutes seems to be tolerable. So depending on what it is that you need to talk about, and if you don't need the slides, just as Elena's pointed out, what's your minimum PowerPoint deck? Do you actually need slides even? Because if it's 0, if your MVP is 0, then maybe you just need to have a great conversation and record it and send that out.
It's really interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
One of the things we're looking at, because I actually teach in this large anatomy class, one of the things we're looking at is that we are likely going to record our lectures due to our class size, because it's just really onerous, and the resource for us to be able to run multiple sessions would be very difficult. There are also other components of this course. It's not just the lecture component that we have to manage. And so what we are looking at doing is, for virtual class time, we're looking at trying to engage with students in other ways. We're toying with ideas of doing sort of a talk show scenario where we'll actually, students can interview faculty from the program with their questions about the content from that particular week. And so looking at different ways of engaging and really creating that social presence that might be missing otherwise in some of these online interactions. Yeah.
And so one of the things you can do to hack the Zoom thing is that you can live stream directly from Zoom. That's a setting that you can have onto YouTube or Vimeo. So one of the things you could do is just we could have run this session with, if we didn't want to do the breakout rooms, just the 4 of us talking heads, kind of like CNN, send out the link and put it into YouTube, and then have you guys just tune in as if it was a show. And that's just a different kind of format. So do think about it. And so definitely it'll be it'll be interesting to kind of see. I think there's some questions around kind of the sweet spot of cognitive load. I think people are looking at like YouTube videos. They've looked at giant MOOCs, so massive online open courses, and what they've done is that they've looked at the video watching analytics to show that there's a massive drop off point beyond 8 minutes, and by 12 minutes most people are gone. So if you think about it that way, it might be that you really can teach one take home point per little video, but then what you want to do is string a bunch of videos that would autoplay, or you could click to the next one, click to the next one. Even with our PFD stuff, we're probably tolerating some 1 hour content, but I have been trying to think about whether or not I should do a little experiment to carve something like this up into like multiple 10-minute things so that people can watch different segments. So they kind of watch the next segment.
So if you have a training program, Teresa, per se, that you need to cover, let's say a totality of 8 topics and everyone is 5 to 10, your suggestion is instead of an 80-minute video that covers them all, you'd rather have 8 5 to 10-minute videos that chunks all that piecemeal, and then they can go back and forth and back and forth as long as they get it done in this certain time frame.
And it's probably not about adult learners per se and that they're special or something, but adults do have children who are going to say, mommy, I need lunch. And so they could pause, but if they just could finish that one video, then they can come back to the next thing, right? And I think that's the reality of the world that we live in right now for a lot of faculty development stuff. So I would put it out there that part of it is just fitting in people's lives. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay, so maybe we'll go to the last case because I'd like to show off my group if that's okay. Sarah, do you mind advancing the slide? I can't do it.
Of course.
Perfect. So the case 4 is a case of Cassian. Cassian's a faculty member who just went on pat leave back from a couple of months off. Cassian is had been put in charge of running these interdisciplinary, interprofessional rounds that were very well attended because they were lunch and learns. And now in COVID, they're like, you can't bring people in to the hospital for rounds. Like that's not doable. They can come if they're on shift, but then that drops off. A lot of people were coming in just for the rounds. And so our group had a really good conversation about the necessary components. So obviously you want to think about why it is that people were coming into these rounds. So our group kind of reflected on the fact that, was it social? Was it for the lunch? Was it because of the content? And so to think through each of those things to truly understand the idea of why people were showing up, and then to replicate those elements when designing this. So if it was about the lunch, then that you might be kind of out of luck. If it was about the social, then maybe it's about thinking about how you bring the social in, right? So that social component of having the meet and greet, have everyone say hi, check in, doing some goofy games, some icebreakers, some maybe using polling rather than for serious things like everyone's been talking about, but like have like, okay, so who's the first person today that's going to be like, need to have someone tell them that they're muted, stuff like that. That's a little goofy that people could have some fun with, right? You could like put out the bingo card for Zoom teleconferences and say, okay, let's see which one of us can do this first, and have some prizes or some interactivity. Having that downtime, I think, is important as well. I think that people kind of like address the idea that definitely fit for design the content. So in the age of COVID, you want to be responsive. So if it's a clinical environment, you probably want to talk about COVID a little bit because people will come to the content. And then I think thinking about how can we be more inclusive, make sure we have people from all the different professions speaking. Think about how the firewalls for the hospital, sometimes you have to be outside of the hospital environment to actually just access Zoom. So just knowing all the logistics so you can give people a hint sheet. That's something that I've learned the hard way. So Google Forms, Google Docs also is firewalled by some of the hospitals. So you have to like get people to connect maybe by their phones or tether or use the visitor Wi-Fi, So these are some things. And then I think it's about kind of making sure that in the continuing environment that you know that there's a greater variation in tech familiarity, but that we can build in some generational humility and make sure that people have a buddy or something like that where they could turn to. And there's some really cool ideas to think about how we actually engage with each other in this medium. So to preserve what it is, I thought that was beautiful. The idea of preserve what works, and then try to think about how we can be opportunistic about the things that are better in this. So that's great. Okay. So we're just gonna flip over now to Q&A to chat a little bit. I'm sure there are people, members of my group, that if they want to highlight some of the things that that I missed, that would be great. I know we had some good conversation there. Roisin, you were there. Dina, if you guys have other thoughts as well. All right.
What if what if you're done like much, maybe if your session has to go over 90 minutes and you're done like in 60 minutes? Is it okay just to ask if there are any questions, or to, you know, do some more Kahoot questions or something? And
yeah, I mean, I think that
what are the
depends.
expectations?
I would say that if you just spoke fast, for instance, and just nailed it and got all the content in, then it might be the speed. You might want to do some breakout groups to see if people want to talk in small groups about a topic. I do know that there's some stories, horror stories that people tell about, like you put people in breakout groups and you're just one teacher. You should probably go visit each one to make sure they're on task. I think Amy was the one to flag that. Sometimes you got to make sure the learners are on task. So definitely something to think about. Amy, have any thoughts about that? Because I think you've been doing a lot of fun, a larger group, mid-sized group of content.
Yeah, I almost always have, you know, an optional activity plan that if I run short, I can make the, you know, last minute decision. Are we just done? And I think everybody appreciates having found time when you think you were going to be at something for 90 minutes and it ends up at 60.
Yeah.
I don't know that you want to be doing that week after week after week and letting class out early. So I almost always have sort of some extra optional activity that if we have time, great. And that at least gives you the option to be able to use that optional activity if you have the extra time. I actually find the opposite. I'm almost running out of time every single week and thinking about, because the students are getting involved in discussion and are being really responsive, and which is great. And so then I say, okay, this is great discussion. I want that to continue to happen. How can I then, you know, shift one of the activities I had planned and move that until the following week?
Yeah, for sure.
Which is great. Yeah.
It's kind of like today. We're running over time right now, you know, because it's so awesome. So that's a big part of it. So thanks so much for sticking around. But I am going to kind of end the session now officially for the recording, and thank everyone. Can everybody do the ritual of turning on your video and doing the clap, if that's okay? So just turn on your microphones too. Don't forget, because we can't hear it clapping. We can see it, but if everyone can do that.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for leading in and getting involved, trying out the Google Docs. We're probably planning to have a bit of a virtual retreat, experiential kind of like fair where you can try different augmentations of Zoom. So we'll probably have different environments. So look out for that event. And there's another video if you want to double back and learn more about Sarah's framework that she's kind of demonstrated, that we've been developing with her, that online toolbox. I think it's a really nice way to kind of like articulate what you're looking for. And what parts. It's kind of like having anatomy, right? Like knowing, going head to toe. Elena is a big advocate for having a systematic approach to thinking through things, and I think that that's kind of the anatomy of a great online learning experience. So it's just systematically go through each of the things and say, do you have this? Do I have this? Do I have this?
Is there a link for that, Sarah?
Yeah, we can put it in the chat, and then we'll so you'll be able to do that. But thanks so much for getting involved, and I'm just gonna stop the recording. But if you guys want to hang out for a couple minutes, we're here.